Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
The Noble Mind podcast is brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kate King.
And I'm Alex Gökçe. In this episode, we talk to Dr. Ronald Siegel about a wide range of topics, including meditation, psychedelics, chronic pain, yoga, why it's important to embrace our habitual ways of avoiding discomfort, but also move toward avoiding avoidance.
Dr. Siegel is an assistant professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, where he has taught for over 35 years. He's a longtime student of mindfulness meditation and serves on the board of directors and faculty of the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy. He's the author of The Mindfulness Solution, Everyday Practices for Everyday Problems, co-author of the self-treatment guide Back Sense, which integrates Western and Eastern approaches for treating chronic back pain, among other books. You can find more about Ron at mindfulness-solution.com.
As for us, we invite you to subscribe to this podcast and be in touch on social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Noble Mind Podcast. You can get this episode's show notes, sign up to receive bonus content, and share your responses and suggestions at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you enjoy the show.
All righty. Well, thank you, Ron, so much for being with us on the podcast today. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And although some people may be familiar with your work because you've been doing lots of great stuff for a long time, other people may be a bit less familiar. So I thought it might be a good place to start to just have you tell us a little bit about your background, your work.
So I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and for many years I've been associated in one way or another with Harvard Medical School and teaching in the Boston area there, and most recently with the Center for Mindfulness and Compassion, which is a wonderful program that started up at Cambridge Health Alliance, which is one of the Harvard teaching hospitals. My clinical work has spanned a number of different topics. I worked as the chief psychologist for many, many years at Cambridge Youth Guidance Center, so working with kids and families, predominantly from poorer economic backgrounds. And my private practice is focused largely on treating chronic pain disorders. But for the last 20 years or so, I've been really focused on helping train clinicians in how to integrate mindfulness practices into psychotherapy and how to bring mindfulness practices out into the world broadly to help people with everyday problems, everything from anxiety and depression to pain or relationship problems or even the indignities and challenges of aging. So that's been a main thrust of my career in recent years.
Wonderful. Could we go back to the early days and hear a little bit about how you first got interested in mindfulness or meditation kind of broadly?
Sure. It was, I really fell into it with the cultural times. I'm in my mid-60s now, so I was coming of age as an adolescent in the late 1960s, and I was in New York. It was an area where the counterculture was running quite strong, and there was a lot of interest in things like introspection generally in psychology, but particularly in meditative practices. And I got interested in that wave when others did. And, a part of the story that I'm now just beginning to discuss, and only because it's become mainstream in psychology, is part of that culture was experimenting some with psychedelic medicines. And I had some early experiences with that were so transformative that allowed me to see my life and others from such radically different perspectives that I became interested in, how else might one come to these understandings? How else might one free one's mind, really, to be present and loving and open in the way that sometimes people will experience with those medicines, and discovered, meditative traditions have been doing this for thousands of years. And I was drawn to that. And the reason I'm now mentioning that early beginning is now that we have FDA-approved trials of drugs like MDMA and psilocybin for everything from end-of-life care to treatment-resistant depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, whereas the use of those as an exploratory mechanism is now sanctioned, and we've got good data that they appear to be quite useful. So I think many people who were introduced to meditative practices years back through this kind of experimentation are now sort of coming out of the woodwork and saying, oh yeah, that was my introduction too. That's very interesting. And this is not to advocate the indiscriminate use of those substances, but that's the true story of what interested me in this.
Yes, and we were, it was suggested that we ask you about psychedelics today, so.
Well, we're about to organize the first Harvard Medical School conference on meditation, psychotherapy, and non-ordinary states of consciousness, including the currently expanding research on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
I just recently read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which really goes over this in a lot of detail. Is there anything that, you know, for somebody who's maybe not so conversant on the topic, that would be a useful bit of information in terms of, you know, what's going on with the psychedelic research, or who might be best helped by that type of work? Or,
well, I think we're still in experimental phases in terms of knowing what's happening empirically, but maybe of relevance to this podcast would be, you know, what are the parallels between the kinds of insights and changes that seem to be psychotherapeutic that come out of properly structured and supervised psychedelic experiences that are parallel to the ones that come from meditative practices, and particularly mindfulness practice. And my sense of that is that they work quite similarly to one another, albeit at different paces. The meditative approach is a more gradual approach, and also with longer lasting effects in terms of changing our lives in meaningful ways. The psychedelic approach can, in a very brief period of time, introduce people to certain insights and certain understandings that then later they could take up meditation and other practices to integrate into their lives. And so what are some of those insights? Well, one of those insights is that much of the time, most of us are in a state of relative constriction where we're defending against or trying to block out of awareness painful mental contents. Everything from early things that happen in our life that are difficult, disappointments, traumas, large and small, hurts, everything from, you know, getting picked last for on the kickball team in elementary school, to having a girl or a boy who we like not like us back, to the teacher who is mean, to much larger difficulties like having parents who have an acrimonious divorce, or abusive parents, or folks with substance abuse, or all of the different things that we now in the mental health field talk about. ACE scores, the number of adverse childhood events that a person has had. And depending on the number of those things that have happened, the chances that we're going to struggle emotionally and in fact struggle with physical disease later in our life increases dramatically. I just came up with a figure that if you have 4 or 5 more of these adverse childhood events, the chances of becoming addicted to opiates increase by something like 4,500 times.
Wow.
Compared to somebody who has not had these experiences. So we all have greater or lesser experiences that have been painful, and we've pushed them out of awareness. What mindfulness practice tends to do, and also the psychedelic practice substances tend to do, is they soften the repression barrier. They soften this capacity we all have as humans to push these things out of our awareness. We push them out of awareness for good reason. They hurt, and perhaps they were overwhelming to us at the time that they occurred. But usually, as one of my patients put it quite eloquently, when we bury feelings, we bury them alive. We don't actually get rid of them. We just manage to push them away. And then we actually spend the rest of our lives in a state of relative constriction and tension as we have to exert psychic energy to block these out of awareness. This is not a new idea. Freud spoke about this when he described defenses, which is really the same thing, which we're now calling experiential avoidance in a more empirically oriented psychology. But this has been described throughout the ages because it's just a universally human protective mechanism. But it comes with its costs. And to the degree to which, when we're safe in our life, and when we have the supports that we need, we're able to let these contents back into awareness, we can become more integrated and more whole. And this has many, many positive sequelae or positive results. One of them is we can connect better to other human beings, because one of the things that keeps us in disconnection is trying to avoid difficult feelings. We don't want to feel vulnerable. We don't want to feel that we can get our feelings hurt by others. And as a result, we tend to block out our feelings, but that also blocks out these opportunities for connection. I'm sometimes, I'll talk to audiences and I'll ask, how many of you have been in an intimate romantic relationship in your life? And most of the hands go up. I say, how many of you have had your heart broken? Same hands go up. And then I'll ask, how many of you, after having had your heart broken, thought, what I really want to do now is really be vulnerable and undefended and get into another intimate relationship? Mm-hmm. None of the hands go up, right? Because mm-hmm. what do we do after we've had our heart broken? We defend, right? We constrict. We say, no, I think I'll avoid that. That was really painful the last time around. Mm-hmm. And we all do this to greater or lesser degrees. And it's only by allowing ourselves to open to that pain and reintegrate it that we have the option to both feel more whole and more relaxed ourselves, but also to really reconnect to other people. And we humans are a very social species. And when, the data is just overwhelming that says when we're not feeling safely connected to one another, we do not do well. We don't thrive physically and we don't thrive psychologically. So one way that both of these things work is toward that, helping us relax defenses, integrate the experiences that have been painful that we pushed out of awareness and become more whole and more connected. Another way that both of these pathways converge is toward reducing self-preoccupation. We are hardwired to be very concerned with our social rank, with how we compare to one another. The evolutionary psychologists tell us that those primates who weren't ranking very high didn't get to reproduce very well. They didn't have a lot of opportunities. You see this in primate after primate. The ones that get to reproduce are the ones that are either dominant males or females that are hanging around with dominant males. Mm-hmm. And so we're all evolutionarily programmed to be preoccupied with how are we doing and how do we compare with others. The way that this shows up in our everyday consciousness is with concerns over self-esteem. How am I compared to you? And we all get into this and we all get hooked on it in different arenas. For one person, it's who's smarter. For another person, it's who's prettier or handsomer. For someone else, when you're young on the schoolyard, who's better kickballer, who can beat up who. For others, it's who's more creative. Among meditators, it gets hilarious. Who makes fewer social comparisons? Who's less concerned with ego? Who's less concerned with who's on top? But all of these things we are simply hardwired to compare ourselves to others. And, unless we live in Lake Wobegon, where all of the women are strong, all of the men are good looking, and all of the children are above average, we're not always going to win. We're going to come out ahead sometimes and behind sometimes. I was once talking to an audience about this, and I said, so who here always wins in these social comparisons? A guy raised his hand, and I thought, avoid him at lunch, right? Because the people who do think they always win, it's, that's no good either. So we have this as a constant companion in human life, this evaluating ourselves. How are we doing and how do we compare to others? And sadly, because we can't always win, almost all of us walk around feeling inadequate in some way. Almost all of us suspect that, oh, it's only me who's insecure. It's me who has trouble, who wonders how other people will think about me, or who wonders what I should wear this morning to fit in or make a good impression. those secure people, they're not suffering from that. This real winners don't suffer from this. This is just my problem. And this is a universal my problem. And one of the purposes of mindfulness practice is to really start to soften this preoccupation with ourselves, particularly this thing we call kind of ego or comparative ego, which is, how am I doing compared to you? And am I a winner or am I a loser? Am I loved or am I not loved in each moment? And the alternative to that, and actually what helps to dissolve that, is safe social connection. Feeling like we're a we rather than a me versus you. And we all know this from our good friendships, if we're fortunate enough to have them. When we're with a good friend, we experience it as we're together. We don't feel like we have to posture. We can relax our defenses, to go back to the earlier theme, and we feel like a we. Mm-hmm. Not a how am I doing compared to you. But when we don't feel that safety, we get very much back into this hardwired concern with dominance hierarchies and how we fit in and how well we're doing. And it's a much less pleasant way to live, a much more stressful way to live. So virtually all of the world's religious traditions have counseled, let it go. This self-preoccupation, trying to aggrandize oneself, is not a pathway to well-being. They've all been right. And meditative traditions have come up as one technology for reducing that and increasing the sense of we-ness and decreasing the sense of independent separateness. Interestingly, one of the pretty reliable effects of psychedelic medicines, especially when they're used in a well-structured environment where people are made to feel safe and are with other people that they can trust and are surrounded by symbols or reminders of their higher, whatever values are most important to that individual. Very often people have what are called transpersonal experiences, these moments in which we don't feel like a separate self. We don't feel like we end at our skin, but we have a much more ecological view, much more of a sense of we are part of the wider world, both the wider world of all living things, the universe more broadly. For some people, this has religious overtones. Some people will understand this experience in a religious context and will feel like I'm connected to God, or I'm part of God, or I'm one of God's children. But it needn't be theistic. It can also be experienced simply as part of the natural world and part of the human family. And these feelings are often deeply transformative to people, and they also occur during meditative practices. So the two are also helpful. The two are also similar in those regards. So I could probably go on for some length, but there's a couple of examples of where these two paths seem to be coming together.
What do psychedelics offer that meditation doesn't? Is it more immediate?
Now, I can't speak for everybody's experience in the world, but from my study of it, from what I can understand, and from my my limited personal experiences, it's rapidity. Yeah, it's that one can have an experience, a profoundly transpersonal experience, or a profound experience of relaxing defenses and integrating material that's been pushed off with. If we look at the FDA-controlled trials of using them as a model, they're usually involving something like 6 hours of psychotherapeutic preparation, and then a day-long experience in which people are reporting these profoundly transformative experiences. With meditative practices, it takes a while longer to see these kinds of shifts. Although meditative practices come in different doses. And if one is doing 20 minutes a day of mindfulness practice, one is going to, we tend to experience gradual changes in our lives. If one goes on a 2-week silent retreat, we tend to experience very profound changes in consciousness. Concentration develops quite rapidly, and thought becomes less central in the landscape of consciousness, and there are more moments between thought, if you will. And in those moments between thought, those are very, very often transpersonal experiences will arise where people do have this sense of, I don't feel so separate. I feel connected to the tree. I feel connected to my fellow meditators here, these kinds of things. So again, it's a higher dose, right? In a sense of, a couple of weeks of silent practice that takes a lot of effort. You've got to go away somewhere. You've got to organize your life around that. And it's slower than ingesting a mushroom or something like that.
I know some of the research talks about the importance of set and setting with psychedelics in terms of your mindset going into it and the setting and context in which you have your experience. And I was just thinking about our daily meditation practice and, how it's that part is also important, what your mindset is as you approach
Absolutely.
your practice, as well as kind of the context in which you do your practice and what you expect of it. And if you go away for a 2-week retreat, you're kind of going into that with a hope or expectation, maybe that you're going to get something out of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the set for retreat practice is, I want to connect more deeply with my inner experience. I want to perhaps connect with nature or God if a person is religious in their theistic in their orientation. And the setting matters. There's a reason why most intensive retreat practice in the meditative world is you go off to some place surrounded usually by nature that feels very safe, where the cell phone is gone and, the intrusions of the nightly news aren't there. And the setting is also very, very important for that. And as people know who have sat silent retreats, if you immediately come out of a silent retreat and walk into a shopping mall, it is quite overwhelming. And it's difficult. It's difficult to integrate that level of stimulation because one becomes quite sensitized. And that happens as well with these, with psychedelics, that one becomes quite sensitized. And that's part of the softening of the repression barrier and the removal of this, our usual defense, or the relaxing of our usual defenses, which is a good thing in terms of integrating material that we're ready to integrate and haven't yet been able to integrate. But it could be not such a good thing if we're in an environment that doesn't feel safe. Those defenses, every one of our defenses that we construct for good reason. At some point in our life, something felt too painful to be able to fully embrace it. So, when doing this work, whether meditatively or in these supervised psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy sessions, it needs to be done carefully with a deep respect for why those defenses evolved in the first place, how they have served us well. And this isn't about just blasting away the bad defenses so as to have these wonderful experiences. It's about learning how to relax the defenses, seeing how they have served us well and seeing how they have not served us so well.
Yeah, and post-processing, integration time, or I know after retreats, people talk about the re-entry phase.
Absolutely.
And you're really taking that time afterwards to make meaning of the experience that you had and to ease back into kind of ordinary life.
Yeah, including easing back into our old defenses, which is part of what happens after a retreat and happens after these psychedelic experiences, that the defenses reconstellate. And it's about easing into that and not panicking that, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose all my gains because my old defenses are coming back. That's even true after sitting for a half an hour, 45 minutes in the morning. And if we're having one of those days in which we're blessed by relaxing deeply and being present and being sensitized and really opening to experience in mindfulness practice. And sometimes that happens, in a morning sitting or an evening sitting outside of a retreat context. And then, realizing, well, then we check our email and it's like, we start to notice, oh, I experience every email as a threat. That's interesting. That's a very interesting observation. Look at that. There's a little bit of constriction. My heart races a little bit. It's like, oh no, how is this email going to hurt my feelings? And, when we're more sensitized, we start noticing that's actually true of every email that we encounter throughout our lives, right? But we don't notice it unless we're sensitized. And we have to somehow be gentle and compassionate with ourselves as we notice, oh, I've just discovered I'm afraid of all of my emails.
I love this idea of kindness and appreciation for your defenses, that they've been doing something to serve you and you can't just jettison them,
Right.
without some thinking and feeling your way through that.
Right. My friend and colleague, Dick Schwartz, who developed something called internal family systems, which is really simply the observation that, gosh, we're made up of a lot of different parts, right? And in this context, there's a part of us that would like to be able to reintegrate and feel all these things and be whole again. But there's a part of us that is appropriately scared to death of that. The part of us that originally blocked out these experiences because they were too much at the time. And, one of the ethos in internal family systems, which absolutely carries through with mindfulness-informed psychotherapy, is everything's welcome. And all of those parts are important. So the defenses, they're there for a reason. They're our friends. This is important, as is the impulse to relax them, as are all the parts that we've blocked out of awareness, all the hurt little kid parts that are, on the one hand, desperately would love to be acknowledged and be able to share their experience. On the other hand, are hiding, under all sorts of rocks because they got hurt so badly the last time they came out.
So is the removal of defenses a much longer term process?
Yeah. All of these things are long-term processes that we can taste them in the short term. So you could taste the dissolution of defenses in a psychedelic experience, or you could taste that in meditative practice. But to really live our lives less defended, that's a gradual process. It's a maturation process. In Tibet, prior to the origins of or the introduction of Buddhism in Tibet, they had a mythology. It was a mythical kingdom called Shambhala. Many of us know that because there's Shambhala Press and the Shambhala community of Tibetan Buddhists. And in the Shambhala kingdom, the highest accomplishment was to be a Shambhala warrior. And these were not warriors with spears and knives and shields and the like. These were warriors of the heart. And they were said to have the courage to feel everything. That was their warrior courage. And the metaphor they used for it was horrifying. They said it was to be in the world like a cow without its skin. Every nerve ending exposed, feeling it all. It was actually a model for what would it be like to not have psychological defenses? What would it be like if we actually felt everything, every joy, every sorrow, every injury we've ever encountered, every moment of love and connection we've ever had, every self-esteem boost where we think, oh, look how wonderful I am, every self-esteem collapse where we think, oh, what a horrible failure I've been. To be open to the full range of experience. And it's interesting, in Western psychology, we don't have any such ideal. We have the idea that, well, it would be better to have mature defenses like sublimation or humor or even rationalization than it would be to have immature defenses like projection, like schizoid fantasy, like denial, right? And indeed, it is better to have the mature defenses. If you can channel your issues into working hard and having fun and being playful with other humans, obviously that's a much better thing than being paranoid or denying reality. But this idea that there might be yet another possibility, which would be to relax defenses sufficiently to be open to everything, well, that's intriguing. And that's what we see in many of the world's mystical and wisdom traditions, where they say, no, it is possible. Now, I don't know if it's possible to maintain it with continuity. I've never personally met somebody that I think is actually doing that, 100%, but it's certainly possible to be more that way. This loops back, if I'm just going to put one other perspective on this, because I think it's a very important point about defenses. Wilhelm Reich was one of Freud's followers, and Reich was, he was kind of the father of body-oriented psychotherapy, things like Rolfing, the deep tissue massage to get at feelings, or bioenergetics, which was designed to similarly liberate feelings that we blocked out and really soften defenses. Those all grew out of Reich's work. And he noticed that every time we defend against a feeling or a thought, we do so by constricting the body in some way. And there's always some muscle tension involved. And in fact, if we read one another's bodies, we can notice the ways in which one another are defending. And this is true in the broadest sense. We say that person's very uptight. Well, what we're saying is that person's constricting their musculature a great deal to block out a lot of difficult feeling. And we all do this to greater or lesser degrees in different moments. Now, Reich famously said, if a person could fully experience an orgasm, it would mean that they were free from psychoneuroses. And that was interesting, it's coming out of
the worthy goal.
Yeah, right, worthy goal. And the whole Freudian world of thinking of sexuality as paramount in psychological functioning. It plays a big role, maybe not as big a role as he imagined. But I think Reich was correct about this, except he was a little too narrow. If a person could fully experience a cup of tea, it would indicate that he or she was free from psychoneuroses, right? Because to be fully present to any experience means not defending. It's coming back to, it's like being the Shambhala warrior. It's being really present. We can only be really present if we're not blocking something out, if we're not trying to avoid some aspect of experience. So, putting this all together, we can see how this process of both relaxing defenses, opening to experience, reintegrating that which has been pushed out of awareness, again in a carefully measured way to not be overwhelmed with too much too fast, through whatever means, whether it's a form of psychotherapy, whether it's a meditative practice, whether it's briefly to have a taste of it through psychedelics, although I again think that one then needs other methods to do the work of integration, or whether it's through yoga, which very interestingly, if you ever step back and think about yoga, before it became, a way to get buff and sexy, yoga was this very weird spiritual tradition. What kind of spiritual tradition seeks liberation of the mind or some form of enlightenment through stretching? Like, why the heck are we stretching to liberate the mind? At first glance, it's like, that's a pretty nutty idea. But if we take this Reichian idea and we start to see, oh, wait a minute, every time we defend, every time we block out some kind of experience, we do it through constricting the musculature, then learning to release the musculature, might that be another path to relaxing these defenses and becoming whole in this way? And indeed, that's my understanding of the overarching principle or mechanism of action in yoga practices. So we see that, so many of these different traditions actually come together. They've all been circling around the same goal.
So these are the much more consequential implications of that Thich Nhat Hanh dictum, like how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Absolutely. As well as Thich Nhat Hanh's wonderful observation that if you're not enjoying the dishes, you're probably not going to enjoy the cup of tea afterward. Because it really, one of the things we learn through these practices is it's about opening to both the pleasant and the unpleasant. So if we're doing something and it's kind of unpleasant, if let's say we think of the dishes as unpleasant, how about opening to that experience? And one of the shifts that happens through mindfulness practice and through all of these different avenues, including many forms of psychotherapy, is instead of our goal moment by moment being, how can I feel better right now? How can I have more pleasure and less discomfort? Our goal becomes, how can I be more present to whatever is unfolding right now? How can I open more fully to this, whatever this is? There's a wonderful Tibetan Buddhist teacher, wonderful and confusing, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was, he had fled Tibet when the Chinese communists came in the 1950s and became educated in the West, went to Oxford and the like, and became a Western teacher. He was also apparently an alcoholic and also slept with his students. So he was enigmatic in terms of, wait, is this what enlightenment looks like? However, he was an extremely clear writer and teacher. And one of the things that he said was, he said that neurosis is the manure of Bodhi. So let's unpack that for a moment. Neurosis, we know what that is. That's our everyday psychological struggles and conflicts. Manure, we know what that is. Well, on the one hand, it's excrement. On the other hand, it's fertilizer. So it has this double-edged quality to it. It's yucky and we want to get rid of it. And it's also fertilizer. And Bodhi is wisdom, right? So the idea that everything difficult that happens in our life, everything that's painful, everything that's conflictual, everything that we wish we could just get to go away might be the manure, the shit or the fertilizer for wisdom, that becomes very interesting. And that becomes kind of this shift in orientation that all of these practices have together. Let's move toward what's difficult or challenging and see how might this help us to see more clearly all sorts of things.
I actually practice in the Shambhala tradition myself. And I think it was Trungpa who said that the obstacle is the path.
Exactly.
I think that's his quote. Yeah. And they in the current Shambhala teachings, they talk about the cocoon as basically what we're talking about is defenses, right? It's the sort of bubble you build around yourself to make the world safe, and then as you go through, your practices and develop your meditative awareness, you gradually start to see and then let go of that cocoon, that sort of safe shell.
Right. Yeah. And life rips it off of us thread
by
thread if we're willing to be attentive to the process.
Yes.
And this in turn has implications all the way from chronic pain and other psychophysiological disorders to the various like your book Mindfulness Solution is really a catalog of practical ways people can apply mindfulness to a range of difficulties.
Yes, and we're basically using a similar approach to experience throughout them. As my friend and colleague, who's a trauma expert at the University of Southern California, a fellow by the name of John Briere, who's also a longtime meditator, he says, in general, the one thing we want to avoid is avoidance. So across the board with all of these different disorders, what we find is that it's our effort to avoid the discomfort, basically the defense, that is what bollockses us up and multiplies our miseries. And maybe it would be useful for our listeners to look at this mechanism a little bit more, because it is the theme of the Mindfulness Solution book and how these practices can be useful for so many different disorders. If I may ask you two and our listeners, do you ever drink alcohol?
I've been known to.
Been known to. Okay. Probably many of our listeners have also. And how many of you out there do it exclusively for the taste? And usually, if I ask in Mendocino County, some of the hands go up. But most of us who are more honest say, well, if it weren't for the psychotropic effects, other things actually do taste better by and large. And, so why do we do this? Because we want to change one state of consciousness into another. We've had a hard day at the office and, musculoskeletally, we're basically a pretzel, at the end of the day from all the accumulated tensions. And we think, a glass of wine, that would be relaxing, or we're going to go to a party and there are people there we don't know, or perhaps worse, people there we do know. And we think, a drink would just, ease the social anxiety a little bit and make this more pleasant. So we want to change one state into another. And that's, in moderation, occasionally it's fine. But if we compulsively need to do that, because we really can't tolerate a wide variety of states of mind, well, then we have a substance use disorder and it's a problem. Or if we look at anxiety, for example, if I were to get anxious before public speaking or flying in an airplane, but I did those things anyway, well, then I don't have an anxiety disorder. I'm just a nervous guy. I happen to be temperamentally a nervous guy, and I do those things, and it's not really an anxiety disorder. It just is nervousness. But if I started avoiding flying in airplanes in order not to feel anxious, or avoiding public speaking in order not to feel anxious, well, then I'd have an anxiety disorder. My life would be constricted. Or even everyday problems like depression. If we think of, what would you guys say? What is the difference in your experience between sadness and depression? Because we've all felt sad, we've all felt depressed. What would you say?
Hopelessness.
Hopelessness, right? Depression has this narrative to it, right? That it'll never get better.
I would also say depression has a broader scope and a more pervasive quality.
It's a very pervasive quality. And if you were to describe that pervasive quality, what would you say? What does it feel like?
Heavy,
Heavy, yeah.
dark.
Heavy, dark. Sometimes people will say deadened,
Not feeling anything.
not really feeling. There's a kind of lifelessness to depression, a kind of, we have anhedonia. We don't experience pleasure. When we're sad, we could be at a funeral and be quite sad, and then somebody remembers something really funny that the deceased did, and there's joy, and then back to sadness. It's very fluid, right? It's very alive in that sense, while depression is like this deadening blanket over everything. And so given that, when Shakespeare wrote "Parting is such sweet sorrow," we get it 400 years later. Had he said "parting is such sweet depression," we think, I can't write, and we wouldn't still be reading him, right? So there's a poignancy to sadness that's missing too, which is part of the deadening. So from that understanding, one aspect of depression is that it too is about defending and trying to avoid, trying to cut out and get rid of something that's unpleasant. And, even if we look at psychoses, probably, not a large number of our listeners are going to be suffering with psychosis, but it happens a lot in the world. And people who are suffering from psychosis, when we look at what are the incidents in their life that cause them to decompensate, which means to go from functioning okay to having some kind of delusional symptom or hallucination, it's almost always something like, well, changing apartments, or leaving home for college, or having a girlfriend or boyfriend break up with us, or having a parent die, or losing a job. It's the things that for the rest of us, when they happen, we feel upset. The things that bring up painful emotions, those are the things that trigger the person to have these psychotic symptoms most of the time. So we can see that across the board with virtually everything that ails us, it's this trying not to feel something painful, not necessarily through a deliberate act, sometimes deliberately, sometimes just automatically blocking it out, that is at the heart of the disorder. And this even applies to chronic pain, because a great deal of my career I spent treating chronic pain disorders, and the vast majority of chronic pain disorders, whatever their initial precipitant or cause, the vast majority include this recursive cycle in which people get stuck, so that at some point the pain reaches a level where it starts to interfere with our lives or starts to worry us. And what we do is we get frightened, like, this isn't going to get better. My own story started with back pain, and that's what I've done a lot of work treating. And there it's like, your back goes out, starts hurting, and you start to get frightened, like, I hope I'm not going to have a bad back like my mother did, like my uncle did, like the guy across the street does. I hope I'm going to be able to take care of my kid. I hope I'm going to be able to work. We start to get frightened of it. When we get frightened, well, what does fear look like in the body? If you guys were to join me, or listeners were to join me in pantomiming, like in an acting class, fear, show what like fear looks like. What does it feel like in the body if you pantomime that? Well, all your muscles tighten up, right? In fact, we talk about being tense. We use the same word for literal physical muscle tension and the experience of fear. When muscles get tense, they hurt. You ever have the muscles around your shoulders tighten up after a hard day at work? They hurt. In fact, a friend will just, sort of spontaneously come and massage our shoulders when we say we've had a rough day. Or if you've ever had a Charlie course in your calf muscle, that hurts terribly, even though there's no damage to the calf muscle, but it hurts a great deal. So we know that tense muscles hurt. So then the pain increases, and we start to then have all the negative thoughts. Oh my gosh, it's getting worse. This is really sinking my life. This is really going to be a problem. That thought creates more tension in the thing. You can see how it creates a cycle. And then that cycle keeps going. And almost everybody with chronic pain then gives up activity. If it's the case of the back pain, well, I won't lift. I won't go to the gym. I won't go do these things. I want it to heal. I don't want it to get worse. And then we actually become weaker. The muscles become shorter and tenser. We become actually more vulnerable to bona fide injuries. And after a while, we get depressed, we get upset, we get anxious, which all feeds into the cycle. So many, many chronic pain disorders have as a component this kind of fear, pain, fear cycle, and a giving up of normal activity, including the activities that used to be our stress releasers. So we see here that the attempt to avoid the pain, the attempt to get it to go away, is actually what perpetuates the cycle, because that's what gets us to stop working out. That's what gets us to stop using our bodies normally, and that's what actually traps us more deeply into the process. So we can see that across the board, whether it's substance use problems, whether it's anxiety problems, depression problems, psychosis, chronic pain, like virtually everything that ails human beings psychologically, the mechanism of all of them has to do with this experiential avoidance, this trying not to feel something painful, which is why the approaches like mindfulness that are basically about systematically moving in the other direction toward experiential approach, toward opening to experience, including discomfort, rather than constricting and trying to avoid it, winds up being curative for such a wide variety of different problems. So that in essence is the thesis in the Mindfulness Solution, and the book talks about how to systematically apply mindfulness practice to these different kinds of problems.
And you also talk about a recovery cycle, just like there's a downward spiral. With the help of skilled healers, they can also be a reversing of that cycle.
Absolutely. The recovery cycle, basically, it starts with a good medical exam to rule out other things, to be responsible about this. Because let's take the case of back pain. Back pain could be caused by a malignancy in the spine. You could have a tumor in your spine. You could have kidney disease. You could have gastrointestinal distress that's being referred, where you're having referred pain to the back. So, you want to rule out the treatable medical stuff. Then after that, the next stage is really rethinking the problem. Almost all of us get wedded to some kind of structural understanding, like, oh, well, it's that disc that's out of place, or it's this subluxation, in other words, misalignment of the vertebrae, or some spinal stenosis. And, since now people can get imaging in, at least in Western cultures, pretty quickly, and since the vast majority of people who are not in pain have some kind of abnormality in their spine, there will always be some abnormality that one could say, maybe that's the cause of it. So you get worried about that. You get this structural idea. So the second stage after the medical exam is you really have to come to understand how the mind can play a very vivid role and a very important role in these disorders, and how to place whatever the structural understanding is in some kind of perspective, like to actually know the research, to actually know, oh yeah, you do have a bulging disc, but so do 2/3 of all people who never had back pain for more than 2 days in their life. So might it be causative? Might be. Is it likely to be causative? No, not at all. So, so you need that phase. And then we start to use mindfulness practices for this. You can use mindfulness practices to open to the experience of discomfort and notice when you're constricting against it in pain, and notice, oh, I don't have to constrict with the pain. I can actually open to that experience. And what one does at the same time is start experimenting with having the courage to resume normal activities, to really start living as though you weren't damaged or injured. And that takes courage, it takes support and the like. And then when the pain kicks up as you do that, you can use mindfulness practices to help. And what the vast majority of people find is, oh, if I can relax into this and actually start turning my attention back to normal activity, I have a lot less discomfort. But the order of events is very important, because most people, when they're struggling with a disorder like chronic pain, they think, I want to get the pain to go away. And as soon as I get the pain to go away, then I'm going to go back to my life. Then I'll start jogging again. Then I'll go to the gym again. Then I'll start going out to dinner again. Then I'll go to the movies. But I got to get the pain to go away first. That actually turns out to be the wrong order of events, because then every time you have the pain, you have more fear. You realize, oh my gosh, I'm going to be disabled, and it keeps you stuck. So you have to actually do it in the other order, which is, oh, let me resume my life fully. Use my mindfulness practice to relax into the pain, but my main focus is, how am I doing in my life? And the metric becomes, instead of what was my pain today, it was, how fully did I lead my life today? And that's what tends to lead people out of it. The other component of this, by the way, is we can then use mindfulness practices to also work with the other emotions, because sometimes it's not just the fear of the pain that's running the show, it's fear of some other feeling inside. This comes back to the idea of what Reich talked about the constriction of the body whenever we're defended against something. Freud had this interesting idea. It didn't get carried much beyond a small psychoanalytic circle, but it was this idea of signal anxiety. He said a lot of times when we're anxious, what we're afraid of isn't some external event. We're afraid of some thought or feeling in ourselves. We're afraid that we're going to feel sad, and we get anxious because we feel we can't tolerate sadness, or we're afraid we're going to feel anger and we're anxious about that. Or Freud was big on sexual issues. We're afraid we're going to notice a homosexual impulse. We're going to notice an incestuous impulse. We're going to notice, some sexual feeling towards somebody we're not supposed to have it toward, and we tense up and we panic around that. And the stress physiologists in modern day have very much picked up on this, and they've said that, the fight or flight system, which is designed to deal with the tigers out there, is activated from the tigers in here. It's a thought or feeling or an image or a childhood memory or bits of past trauma coming back from the grave, if you will. We get anxious about those, and very often those are the source of the kind of muscle tension that can create chronic pain. So sometimes, even once a person has gotten their life back together, we need to use mindfulness practices and other techniques to explore, okay, so what are these feelings that you're having trouble with? And is there a way to open to them and allow them back into awareness?
So you write about also applying cognitive restructuring and as you described, working with negative emotions in this process, this mix
Yes.
of mindfulness.
And the cognitive restructuring is simply rethinking this, like instead of it, might it be plausible that rather it being the disc out of place, which is found in 2/3 of people without pain, might it be that I'm really angry at work and afraid of that? Or might it be that I'm really scared that this back pain is going to ruin my parenting and I'm not going to be a good mom or dad? Or, to start looking at, thinking psychologically rather than mechanically about these disorders.
And you also write about silver linings of addressing these disorders.
Yeah, absolutely. When people get out of these things, and by the way, my two patients over my clinical career who were stuck in these cycles for the longest time and popped out of it by understanding what was going on and taking up some mindfulness practice, were both stuck for 40 years in very, very restricted disabilities based on back pain. And they both went back to playing tennis. One in there, a guy went back to playing tennis in his 60s, and a woman went back to playing tennis in her 70s after 40 years of really limited disability. Mm. And both of them, and lots of other people who have gotten their way out of this, say, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But what I learned about how the mind works and how we get ourselves into trouble and how we can get ourselves out of psychological trouble, I'm deeply grateful for that. And that's the silver lining. And really what they learned was, oh, I get it. Avoid avoidance. It's the attempt to not feel things that is what is causing my misery, whether it be the attempt to escape the pain or the attempt to not feel all sorts of emotions. And all of my efforts at defending, at protecting myself have actually been the main fountain for my suffering. And I'm so grateful to have noticed that there's actually another path. There's another way to work with my experience.
And you also write that all these difficulties have an evolutionary root.
Oh, absolutely. We come by our problems naturally. Right? To circle back to the idea of, the self-esteem problems we were talking about, that is hardwired in us. You can put certain kinds of crickets together, and inside of a few seconds, they will organize themselves into a dominance hierarchy. Like, who's the big man cricket here? And everybody else is like trying to please the big man cricket. Like, crickets will do this, right? Children will do it. You can take groups of children at age 3 or 4, and inside of a few minutes, they will organize themselves into what are called transitive dominance hierarchies. So if Juanita knows that she can dominate George, and George knows that he can dominate Susie, Susie knows she can be dominated by Juanita, right? And Like kids organize themselves this way almost immediately. Adults, if you put them in 3-person groups, even before they start talking to one another, they'll be able to predict the dominance hierarchy. It's like we get it from reading each other's body language, from reading cues about social class and things like that. So now this is simply one example of things that are evolutionarily hardwired into us. These dominance hierarchy situations, they worked well for mammals and crickets and birds, pecking orders. They worked well for reproductive success, right? They just don't make us very happy. They make us miserable all day, feeling like, I'm a loser again. Other aspects of this, our fight or flight system that is so useful for dealing with emergencies out there in the African savannah, so helpful for trying to run away from a lion. But when it's triggered all day long with every single thought that, oh no, my feelings might get hurt. Oh no, my self-esteem might crash. Oh no, I might not get the flavor of ice cream I want. All day long it's being triggered. This is wreaking havoc on our musculature. It's evolutionary. It makes perfect sense. We're all in it together, but it doesn't make us very happy. Even our capacity for thinking, which is, so adaptive as human beings. Because, imagine, our ancestor, Lucy, Australopithecus, out there in the African savannah, some 4 million years ago. She's about 3 feet high. And she's got, something between fur and our skin, right? And how the heck is she going to survive? What's she going to do face to face with a lion? Grit her teeth and show her claws? That wouldn't be too effective. She wasn't very fast. She couldn't run away. What's she going to do? And, so we think of what were her resources. Well, she had this fight or flight system. That was good. She could run a bit. She had a prehensile or opposable thumb, right? Like we do. She could pick things up and make tools. That was going to be helpful. It eventually led to having podcasts and other things. Quite nice. But, the main thing that she had was she had this ability to think, right? She could review the past for pleasure or pain and anticipate, okay, how do I strategize? How am I going to, come out ahead? And the problem is that our thinking apparatus, which is what we spend most of our day in, is not some neutral computer, right? It has this very strong, what's called the negativity bias, or what my friend and colleague Rick Hansen says, the negativity bias. The brain is like Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good ones. Good experiences happen, slide right off the pan. Bad experiences happen, they get stuck. And it makes perfect sense, because if you imagine Lucy facing an ambiguous situation out there in the savannah, let's say she's looking at some bushes and there's a beige shape behind the bushes, she could make one of 2 types of errors. They kind of correspond to type 1 and type 2 errors in modern scientific research. A type 1 error would be to look at the bushes and go, oh my God, it's a lion, when it's really just a beige rock. A type 2 error would be, it's a beige rock, when it's really a lion. Now she could make countless type 1 errors and still live to tell, and still pass on her DNA to her offspring. One type 2 error, end of the DNA line. So we might imagine that there were happy hominids in her day, holding hands, singing kumbaya, remembering luscious pieces of fruit and dynamite sexual encounters and telling stories about those. They were really happy, but they were not our ancestors, because they died before they got to reproduce, right? Our ancestors were the ones wandering around savannah saying, oh, it could be a lion. Oh no, looks like one of those poisonous snakes. Oh no, not one of those plants with those prickers again. That was horrible last time. Those were our ancestors. And that's why when we take up mindfulness practice, right, we notice, my God, my mind is filled with a lot of painful thoughts, right? Imagining things going bad, worrying about that email we sent this morning, thinking about our mortality. We're constantly involved in, most of us don't spend our session when we take up morning mindfulness practice, blissing out, remembering about the tangerine yesterday. It's simply not what happens. We wind up anticipating what might go wrong and strategizing around it. So this too is another one of our, evolutionary legacies that was great for survival, but not very good for happiness. And also, it's one of the reasons why when we take up practices like mindfulness practice, we spend so much time stepping out of the thought stream. Like, why do we come back to the breath? Why do we come back to sounds? Why do we come back to the sensation of the feet on the ground? It's because it's by stepping out of the thought stream that we get to not believe in our thoughts so much. And we can start to see thoughts as thoughts. We develop what in cognitive behavior therapy is called metacognitive awareness, which is, oh, that's a thought that I'm a failure. which is different from being a failure. Oh, that's a thought that I recently leaned over in the car. I was in a van that had an armrest to grab a peach that had rolled onto the floor. I wasn't driving, but I did, and somehow I pushed a rib into the armrest. And last night I'm Googling, broken ribs, and it's saying 6 weeks of, no athletic activity. I'm saying, no, not 6 weeks. So it allows us to think, oh my God, did I break a rib? Right. And yes, it's a prudent question on the one hand, but on the other hand, every time I feel a little bit of ache, to panic and go, oh my God, my rib's broken. I'm not going to be able to exercise for 6 weeks. I'm going to get depressed. That's not so helpful. Right. So this, learning to notice, oh, that's a catastrophizing thought about my rib, rather than my rib's definitely broken and the next 6 weeks are going to be terribly limiting. All of this metacognitive awareness, seeing thoughts as thoughts, can be enormously useful. And that's one of the core effects of mindfulness practice, is to be able to see thoughts in this way. So I know that I'm weaving quite a number of threads together here, but I believe they actually come together into a tapestry. The evolutionary determined propensities that cause us a lot of unhappiness are thinking and having a negativity bias, being very concerned with our social rank and how we're doing, so we're always stuck in self-esteem problems and so often feeling inadequate, being having a fight or flight system that's great for emergency action but makes us miserable, takes a terrible toll on our body when it's activated by every passing thought and fantasy, and all of these things cause a lot of grief. I will say, on the plus side, we have some evolutionary mechanisms that are really good, and actually, I mean, they're all good, but that are really helpful for our sense of well-being. And one of those is our mammalian tendon befriend system, right? The system that we've got quite naturally, that when we see a cute puppy or give birth to a child, we just want to take care of them. We just love them. And we also have this strong cooperation system, right? Of like, hey, let's work together as a tribe to survive, and let's share the bison if somebody manages to bring one home, and all that stuff. So that whole part of our evolutionary history also can be helpful to us. Is as that one we have to actually work to activate a little bit, and that's where compassion practices, loving kindness practices, all of these things that help to bolster that evolutionary tendency start to become so important, and that's why they're part of so many meditative traditions. I'll just say about that unfortunately, in terms of our evolutionary past, that loving, tendon, befriend, compassion system gets overwhelmed easily when we become frightened. So, and we see this in the political arena, that, demagogues will say, be afraid of those bad other people that are going to hurt you. And as soon as that happens, our compassion for those other people drops away. When we're frightened, we don't care about the welfare of that which is frightening us. And it's because of that. And you could see why evolutionarily, if you had to favor, if natural selection were going to favor one of these motivational systems over the other, survival first, and then survival for me first, and then we'll look, all of us surviving and cooperating, that kind of thing came a little secondarily. And so that's why we have to actually deliberately cultivate that other strand of, how to connect safely to one another.
So I see that the clock is running down a little here, and maybe just one more question in terms of bringing, this wonderful conversation into a pragmatic, practical arena. Is there, if people are listening and they're thinking, maybe there's one thing I could do different today, or one practice I could take up, or, some small tweak that might help me be able to be a little less experientially avoidant or a little more mindful, what would you say might be a good starting point for people?
Well, if somebody hasn't done any mindfulness practice before at all, I think it would not be a bad idea to set aside a little time and experiment with that. Maybe listening to recorded practices. There are all sorts of apps out there like Headspace or Insight Timer that have it. I have a bunch of recordings on my website, which is mindfulness-solution.com, of a number of different exercises that are designed for different kinds of problems. The website's kind of linked to the Mindfulness Solution book. So one thing is to take a few minutes out of your day and see what it's like to formally do some practice, and to practice sitting quietly somewhere and shifting the attention gently and lovingly from the constant thought stream to some sensory experience, whether it be the breath or sounds, and there are meditations for each of those. Many people will start with just following the breath as a way to begin. Alternately, if you don't have the time to do that, just decide during some time in which you're not having to do anything cognitively challenging, sometime when you're walking from one place to another, perhaps, that you simply bring your attention to the sensations of walking. Just feel what it feels like to put the feet on the ground, notice one foot in front of the other, notice the sights and sounds around you, and just gently bring the attention out of the thought stream and into present reality. I think that's one way to start. There are many, many different mindfulness practices, some that are designed to cultivate compassion and acceptance, others that are designed to cultivate equanimity, others that are designed to just cultivate attention and show up in the present. But I think if I were to start somewhere, I'd start by, let me just experiment a little bit with being a little bit more present and see what happens, and see if you can have an attitude of loving acceptance toward whatever might arise.
I really like the emphasis on just experiment. It has a sort of, as you're describing it, it has this relaxed, curious quality instead of like, start a meditation practice 20 minutes a day or else,
No, this is all very experimental. And even those of us who have been at it for decades find that, our level of regularity varies from week to week, from day to day, from time in our life to other time in our lives. I have seen something very consistently, which is that when I practice more, the likelihood of moments of sanity arising in my consciousness is increased. When I practice less, decidedly decrease, fewer moments of sanity arise. So there seems to be a pretty strong correlation between practice and relative sanity, but that doesn't mean I'm super disciplined.
Right. So, you mentioned your website, so we'll put that in our show notes. If people are enjoying this conversation and want to engage more with you or your work or ideas, aside from the website, is there anywhere else you might direct people to?
At the moment, it would be the website. Forgive me, depending on when you hear this, you're either going to get a very primitive website or you're going to get a newly developed one that looks like I'm living in the 21st century. But either way, it's a good entree. It lists, a lot of other books and recordings and things that I've been involved in, but I'm also not the only person out there. There's so many people offering really useful materials. I know there will be a whole lot of other podcasts in your series, and some will emphasize different aspects of this journey. Some are going to emphasize more developing compassion for oneself and for others. Others will emphasize more the interpersonal realm and how to work relationally with these practices. They can touch every aspect of our life, and there are many different paths, and each of us has to find our own way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for all of your good human effort in your teaching and your writing and all the ideas you've shared with the world. And thank you also for your time today.
Thank you so much, Ron.
Thanks so much, and thanks for all of your efforts in putting this series together. I think it's a great service to folks.
Wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks for listening today. This podcast was brought to you by the Institute for Meditation and Psychotherapy, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the integration of mindfulness, meditation, and psychotherapy. For more information, visit meditationandpsychotherapy.org.